Welcome to our College Savings webinar. Today's webinar features Mark Kantrowitz, Publisher and VP of Research for SavingForCollege.com, who will walk you through the basics of how to save for college and how to get the most out of a 529 plan. I'm Martha Kordiak-Mert, COO of SavingForCollege.com, and I'll be serving as the moderator today. Some basic info about our webinar. We collected questions during the registration process. Some of those questions will be addressed in the information that Mark presents. We'll also save some more time at the end of the webinar to address additional questions. If you have a new question during the webinar, please type it into the Q&A section of the screen, and we'll address those as time permits. We do get many questions during these webinars, so we'll try to address the most common ones. If we don't get to yours, please visit our forum at forum.savingforcollege.com and try asking your question there. Also, we will be sending a follow-up email with links to a recording of this webinar, as well as a link to download the slides that you'll see. Today's webinar is brought to you by Ohio's 529 plan, College Advantage, the plan that can. I also want to let everyone know that College Advantage is celebrating 30 years of saving for college by giving away 30 college savings awards, ranging from a $3,000 grand prize to 29 runner-up prizes of $529. I'll provide a link at the end of the webinar if you're interested in learning more. And now, I'm excited to announce that Tim Gorell is here as well. Tim is the Executive Director of the Ohio Tuition Trust Authority, which manages the College Advantage 529 plan. Welcome, Tim. Thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon, Martha. Thank you for having me.
Sure. So Tim is going to address a few questions for us before we get into our presentation. And we want to start by acknowledging that the global pandemic and the resulting economic crisis is on so many people's minds. We know that many people have lost jobs or experienced a reduction in income, and in general are just worried about the future. So we wanted to start with a poll to see how this has impacted our audience members today. So I am going to launch this poll, and the question is, have you put off saving for college or opening a 529 plan because of the current economic situation? Yes or no? And I see people are already answering that. So we'll give you a few seconds for people to jump in and respond, and then we'll share the results. It's really cool to see to see this real time. Okay, it looks like we have a good number here. So I'm going to end the poll. And let's share the results. Is everyone able to see the results on the screen? All right. So basically it looks like 23% of people have made a change, either put off saving for college or opening 529 plan, but 77% of people have not, which is really encouraging and great news. So Tim, my first question to you is, how does that compare to what you're hearing from investors at College Advantage?
It is very interesting because it is consistent with what we're seeing, both of our internal analytics and also with those of our partners, that people are pretty much staying the course. Obviously, you can't ignore the economic crisis right now and how that may have an effect on people. But I think our account holders and people that are looking to save for those educational expenses after high school see this as the opportunity. The market is down. It's the idea of buy low, sell high, and there is the opportunity. But I think what's more important is that your goals don't change. If you are saving and investing for a beneficiary, whether that's a child or a grandchild, or some family member do something after high school, whether that be a trade school, a technical school, a community college, 2-year, 4-year, an apprenticeship, whatever the case may be, there will be costs associated to that, and it's best to save and invest for that, where that may come. What maybe this pandemic's done is maybe cause an adjustment to those goals, and that maybe a beneficiary was planning to go further away from school or go on campus somewhere where now this has caused people to rethink those after high school education and training opportunities and do something else. But nonetheless, there'll still be costs affiliated to those.
Right. That's great perspective. I guess the other question I had for you is, have you heard a different set of concerns or questions coming up since this crisis started? What are, is there anything different in that way in terms of what you're hearing from families at College Advantage?
Yes, and most of it because people are looking for information about what our partners, I'm talking about our investment partners, are advising and recommending. People try to, what's the market going to do? When is it going to return? Those types of things. But as far as the mechanics that we're hearing, people initially contacted us because there was maybe an inclination, or people were thinking about making exchanges. Should they change their investment strategies or not? And we would remind people that it's a federal statute and provision that you can only make 2 exchanges in a given calendar year. And so the idea is maybe don't make a decision based on panic or emotion, because if somebody did their exchanges early on and then later they want to change back, they may be limited in doing so. And so those fell off very, very early. Another questions we get is, from people who have received refunds from school. As you know, that the spring was in disarray as far as schools not having students on campus, or varying degrees of instruction that was going on, and primarily people received refunds maybe for room and board, among other education expenses. And how do you recontribute those, which you can do without a penalty? And then now we're getting into a time where people are looking to the fall for education expenses resuming, and then they want to know how to withdraw funds and how about putting those resources to work for those educational expenses.
All right. Yeah, no, that's some great advice and information. And I think we're going to come back to some specific questions at the end of the webinar. And I know there are some related exactly to some of the topics you brought up. So maybe we can talk about that in a bit more information. Finally, any other advice you can share with our audience today, especially that 23%, I think it was, who said they have been feeling hesitant or unable to start right now?
Yeah, again, understanding that there may be an economic impact that preempts, from staying the course or even opening an account. But it's $25, and I'm not minimizing that. Wow, it's just $25, but that's the minimal contribution as far as opening an account or sustaining an account. So maybe you were looking at higher contributions to savings, and you just can't do that right now. But we would try to assure people and to think, use a philosophy of realistic optimism, because we will get through this. And if you can continue to save and invest, stay the course, we urge people to consider doing so. And because in the end, you will come out ahead.
All right, that's great words. Okay, so thanks, Tim. We appreciate your support and for helping us make this webinar possible. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Kantrowitz to begin our presentation. Note that Tim will also be available to answer questions during our Q&A after the presentation. Take it away, Mark.
Thank you, Martha. So the topic is how to save for college, and the advice we're giving works whether or not there's a pandemic going on. So let's start by comparing the various options you have to save for college. There are 529 college savings plans, Coverdell education savings accounts, Roth IRAs, and taxable custodial bank and brokerage accounts. It's worth noting that with the Coverdell education savings accounts, yes, there are some income restrictions, but those are on the contributions, not on distributions. So 529 plans and Coverdell education savings accounts are similar in that you're saving money in a special purpose vehicle to save for college. Coverdells can be used to save for K-12 education, and within the last few years, 529 plans can be used up to $10,000 per year per beneficiary to pay for K-12 tuition. And you have a broad variety of investments with 529 plans. They're more like mutual funds with some specially designed mutual funds for age-based asset allocation, which starts off aggressive and becomes more conservative as college approaches, whereas the Coverdells, you can invest in individual stocks and bonds. But for most people, the options that are provided by a 529 plan are exactly what they need. Next, let's compare the various college savings options. What's considered an eligible expense, a qualified expense for each of these investment vehicles? Clearly, with an UGMA or UTMA account, a custodial bank or brokerage account, there are no restrictions. You can use it for any purpose, not just for education. With a Roth IRA, you can use it for tuition, fees, book supplies, and equipment, as well as there's a provision for special needs expenses, but it's among the more restrictive of qualified expenses. With a Coverdell Education Savings Account, you also add in room and board and K-12 expenses, not just tuition, but also other elementary and secondary school expenses. Now, with a 529 plan, it has among the broadest set of qualified expenses. They can be tuition, fees, books, supplies and equipment, computers, special needs expenses for a disabled child, and some room and board expenses, as I mentioned before, up to $10,000 in tuition expenses for private K-12 schools. The Secure Act last year added up to $10,000 in student loan repayment. That's a lifetime limit for the beneficiary and a lifetime limit for the beneficiary's siblings. And you can change the beneficiary to be the parents to repay parent loans as well. Okay. Now let's turn to some basics about 529 plans. Okay, and Martha was going to do a new poll now.
All right, let me bring that up. And let's see. All right, so this poll, just kind of test a little bit of the knowledge of people in our audience. So the question is a true-false question. I must open a 529 plan offered by my own state. True or false? And the answers are pouring in really fast this time. I feel like a lot of people know the answer. All right, let me go ahead and thanks for everyone who voted. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll because it stayed pretty similar here. Looks like 6% of people believe that's true, but 94% of people got the answer right, which is it is false. And Mark, you're going to talk a little bit about that, I think, as you go through these slides.
Sure. You can invest in most states' 529 plans. There are a few that are closed to non-residents. You can use that money to pay for education in any state. There are some advantages to investing in your own state's 529 plan if your state offers a state income tax deduction or tax credit. But you also want to consider the fees associated with a 529 plan. So there's a trade-off between having lower fees in an out-of-state plan and having a state tax break with an in-state plan. And a lot of that depends on your individual state's offerings. And there are some states where you can get the state income tax break and invest in any state's plan. So just to address the basics, a 529 plan has tax and financial aid advantages and is a special purpose vehicle for saving for college costs. And there are many 529 plans. All but one state have at least one 529 plan. Several states have two or more 529 plans. And some of the most organizations that manage a lot of plans are listed below on this slide. So you may be investing in a plan that has a different plan manager, and the plan managers have a lot to do with the investment options that are available, as well as the fees that are charged. Now let's talk about some of the benefits of a 529 plan. as I said, there are tax and financial aid advantages. The tax benefits allow you to use the money for tax-free when you use them to pay for higher education. And at the state level, there may be a state income tax deduction or tax credit. About 2/3 of the states that have state income taxes provide such a benefit. The financial aid impact is that it is treated as a parent asset on the FAFSA if the account is owned by either the parent or the child, and that yields one of the lowest possible impacts on financial aid eligibility. For every $10,000 saved in a 529 plan, the reduction in financial aid is at most $564, which still leaves you with $9,436 to pay for college costs. You don't have to be the account owner to contribute to a 529 plan. So if you're a grandparent who wants to give to money for your grandchild's college education, you can give to a parent-owned 529 plan or to a 529 plan that's owned by the child. You don't have to open your own 529 plan. And you have a lot of flexibility with these 529 plans. You can change investment allocations twice a year. You can change the beneficiaries if one of your children decides not to go to college. You can use them to pay for college at pretty much any accredited college in the U.S. And there are about 400 international colleges that you can also use 529 plans at. There are no income phase-outs on contributions or distributions, and you can save an awful lot of money to cover the college costs. I mean, they range from a minimum of $235,000 in terms of the maximum contributions to $529,000, and these are adjusted every year to compensate for increases in college costs. So the name of the game with saving for college is your greatest asset is time. The sooner you start saving, the more time there will be for your investment to grow. And here we show the number of years of investment availability, and you can see that as the amount of money that you save, the amount of time available so that you're saving for a longer period of time, the more your assets can grow. And this particular example involves an initial investment of $500 and either $50, $100, or $200 monthly contributions. And so if you start from birth and you're giving $200 a month, you're going to accumulate just under $100,000 to pay for college. And the best age to start saving for your child's college education is before they're born. That's what I did. But it's never really too late to start saving for college because every dollar you save is a dollar less you're going to have to borrow. And the sooner you start saving, though, the more time there is for your earnings to compound. If you start saving from birth, about 1/3 of your college savings goal will come from the earnings, whereas if you wait until the child enters high school to start saving, then it'll be about 10% will come from the earnings. But once again, every dollar you save is a dollar less you're going to have to borrow, which will, college savings plans are the antidote to student loan debt, and the more money you've saved, you have more choice of what college you send your child to. You might be able to send your child to a more expensive college than you otherwise could have afforded. So now when you're choosing a 529 plan, and you need to figure out which plan is the best match for your needs. So let's look at the two main types of 529 plans, the prepaid tuition plans and the college savings plans. So the prepaid tuition plans involve a promise that you buy a year's tuition now, it's always going to be worth a year's tuition. So in effect, you're paying for it earlier or over time, and you get usually a certain number of units, or you buy a year's tuition, you're getting a year's tuition. And they provide a hedge against tuition inflation, and they have some utility in, for example, when the parents are divorced and there's a college support obligation to pay for half of future college costs, one parent can discharge that obligation by investing in a prepaid tuition plan. And they're best for students who are going to study in that same state. And there's only about a dozen states that offer prepaid tuition plans. There's also a private college 529 plan that is available at several private nonprofit colleges and is a national prepaid tuition plan. Whereas with the college savings plans, you have a lot more flexibility. They are the most popular type of college savings plan, a 529 plan. And with a 529 plan, you are investing after-tax dollars. The earnings accumulate on a tax-deferred basis, and the distributions are tax-free if you use them for qualified expenses, just like, say, a Roth IRA. And like a Roth IRA or 401k, you're investing in mutual funds as opposed to individual stocks and bonds. That helps diversify your investments so you're managing the risk. And because it's investing in the stock and bond markets, your investments will go up or down in value based on the performance of the stock and bond markets. And recently we've seen the S&P 500 go down by as much as 34%, but we started coming back up, and we will soon recover from that. I think it's a total of 19 of the 529 plans offer FDIC-insured investment options within the 529 plans, where if you're worried about the volatility of the market, you can essentially get the equivalent of a bank CD or an actual bank CD within the 529 plans. Now, the 529 plans are split into two main types. There are direct sold plans and advisor sold plans. So the advisor sold plans involve more active management, where you have an investment advisor to give you advice and to tell you, stay the course. Yes, the stock market is plunged, but what goes down comes up. If you sell now, you're just going to lock in your losses and you'll miss out on the economic recovery. Whereas direct sold, you're investing directly with the state and you're managing the process yourself. In both cases, you have the option of an age-based asset allocation. About 2/3 of families are in such age-based asset allocations, which start off with somewhere between 80 and 100% stocks when the child's young. If the stock market plunges, you have 17 years ahead of you to recover from the losses, and you probably don't have as much money invested at that point in time. And as college approaches, your percentage equities will reduce until you get down to 20% to 10% stocks, with the rest in bonds or fixed income or even in cash or other low-risk investments. There are pros and cons of each. That a lot depends on your individual circumstances. I mean, if you've got a lot of investments outside of 529 plans with an investment advisor, you might want to just have an advisor sold plan to have it all unified with under one advisor's recommendations, so that they have the complete picture of your finances, as well as some of the 529 plans will give you a little bit of a break on the fees if you have a lot of money invested in an advisor sold plan. Right. So, as I said before, there's a trade-off between state income tax breaks and the lower fees. So here we're looking at a map of the U.S. showing what the state income tax break is worth, assuming that you've invested $100,000 in taxable income with a $100 per month to each of their two children's 529 plans. And you can see that depending on the state, you have a different value of the investment. I mean, the ones that are in tan or light tan, the two tannish colors, are either states that have no state income tax, so they don't give a state income tax break, or do not currently offer a state income tax deduction or tax credit. Whereas the ones in blue are the ones that offer a state tax break. And as you can see, they range from tens of dollars to hundreds of dollars, depending on the state. Now, as I said, there's a trade-off between state income tax breaks and low fees. The fees can tend to range from as little as 0% for the all cash options to passively managed plans that investment portfolios that can be as low as 2 basis points, 0.02%, to as much as 1.26%. So you do need to consider those fees. And the fees are charged on the plan assets on an annual basis, where the state income tax break is based on your contributions to the plan. There is, in many of these plans, an inflection point where the benefit from having lower fees shifts to the benefit of the state income tax break, usually around the time the student enters high school, because then the state income tax break functions more like a discount on tuition, whereas before, you'd be amortizing it over a much longer period of time, and so the individual impact is lower. So some of your other considerations are to understand who the plan manager is, what is the risk of upheaval of the plan. If the plan's contract with that plan manager is close to expiration, are they going to continue, or is a new plan manager going to be brought in? That can have an impact on the stability of the investment strategies, because when you have a new plan manager, sometimes the investment options change. You want to know not just what the annual expense ratio is, but also if there are any fees for opening the 529 plans. And then within the 529 plan, you want to know what are the investment options. Usually there are some actively managed investment options and some passive or index funds. And some people prefer one or the other. There may be specialty investments like environmental friendly investments. There may be FDIC insured investments. And then there are the age-based asset allocation. And one thing you should ask yourself is, how tolerant are you of the risk of loss of your investments? I mean, do you want a really aggressive investment or a less aggressive investment? Like, if the stock market goes down by almost a third, as it did recently, are you going to panic and pull out the money, or are you just going to stay the course and let it ride, knowing that what goes up goes down, what goes down goes up? The stock market is extremely volatile, even in the best of years. But in the long run, and this is a long-term investment, generally you will come out ahead. So within the 529 plans, and you can choose different types of investments. And as I said, you need to consider your risk tolerance when choosing investments. But the three main are static investments, where it's one portfolio, dynamic investments like the age-based asset allocations, and then the FDIC insured investments, where your investment is insured against complete loss. And the FDIC insured, they go up in value, they don't go down in value. And so we see here a chart that shows the distribution of the investments in many 529 plans, and it's the donut chart. You can see that the biggest area is for large cap investments, and that small caps is much smaller, and that the next largest is fixed income. And that's because people shift their investments to less risky as college approaches. And then you see a typical age-based asset allocation, which divides ages into ranges, before pre-K, elementary school, middle school, high school, and then when they're in college. Some will do changes every single year. Some will do just 3 or 4 portfolios instead of 5 or 6. Each plan is different. Now let's talk about the impact of college savings plans on financial aid eligibility. But before we do so, it's time for another poll from Martha.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And this is our final poll. And basically, this is a yes/no question. The question is, I worry that saving in a 529 plan may reduce my family's financial aid eligibility in the future. So I just launched that, and go ahead and we'll get some answers in. And Mark, you'll have a sense of what's on people's mind as you go through this section.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we'll give it another minute. I think we're reaching that equilibrium point here. The answers are staying pretty steady. All right. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to end and share this poll. It's pretty evenly split, Mark. About almost half, 49%, said yes, they do worry about reducing their financial aid eligibility by saving in a 529 plan. About half say no.
And that was very interesting. There is a penalty for saving for college, just like there is a penalty for saving in taxable accounts. But it's a relatively small penalty. Normally, if you were to save in a custodial bank or brokerage account in the child's name, 1/5 of that money would reduce the child's eligibility for need-based aid. But with the 529 plans, the child's assets in a custodial 529 plan or a parent-owned 529 plan will be treated as a parent asset on the free application for federal student aid. And as I noted earlier, the maximum assessment rate is 5.64%. And usually it's less because it's a bracketed system. So it will have an impact on your amount of financial aid, but a relatively small impact. Not enough that it should cause you to say, oh, I'm not going to save it all for college, because people who save have more flexibility in college choice and their children graduate with less debt. And that's why you really should save as much as possible. And plus, there's a possibility that in the future, Congress may decide to disregard the college savings plans entirely. There's something in the FAFSA formula called the Asset Protection Allowance, which has been quietly disappearing over the last several years, since 2009. Congress needs to implement a fix. One possible fix would be, that's been proposed, is to disregard 529 plans entirely. We don't know that they're going to do that, but it has been proposed in the past. The Higher Education Act, which controls how that is treated in the financial aid formulas, it's typically reauthorized every 4 or 5 years, but recently we're 11 years past the previous reauthorization, so we're overdue for a reauthorization. We were very close before the pandemic hit, so maybe Congress will be able to get it done this year, or otherwise it might have to take until the next Congress for them to implement changes. But I'm optimistic that Congress will do something nicer for 529 plans, like disregarding money saved for college entirely in the financial aid format. So we'll see what happens. So here's the basic formula that's used on the FAFSA. You have a parent contribution and a student contribution. The parent contribution and the student contribution are both based on income and assets. There are different assessment rates for each. Parent income is up to 47% of what remains after subtracting certain allowances for basic living expenses, for federal and state income taxes, and when you have two parents working versus just one, there's an employment expense allowance, a whole bunch of those things. And the parent contribution is divided by the number of children in college, and that's very important. When you have multiple children in college, it can have a really big impact on the amount of financial aid you get. Because when you go from one child in college to two children in college, that's like dividing the parent income in half. That can have a really big impact. Then for the student, there's kind of an assumption that all of the student's income and all of their assets are for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to pay for college. So there is some student income is sheltered up to, it's $6,840 this year. It changes every year. is sheltered, but beyond that, half of all student income reduces the aid eligibility. And that can include things like non-qualified distributions will count as income on a subsequent year's FAFSA. And 1/5 of their assets will reduce their aid eligibility. Okay. And as we noted before, student assets include custodial bank and brokerage accounts like UGMA and UTMA accounts, the mutual funds, other types of savings that are in the child's name as opposed to the parent's name. Parent income includes distributions from a Roth IRA. Even a tax-free return of contributions counts as income. It counts as untaxed income on the FAFSA, which functions the same way as adjusted gross income. That's part of total income. But money that's in a qualified retirement plan account, like a Roth IRA or a 401k or a traditional IRA, is ignored as an asset on the FAFSA, as is the net worth of the family's principal place of residence. Right. Now, the nice thing is that if you have a child-owned or a parent-owned 529 plan, the distributions from that 529 plan are ignored, but it is reported as a parent asset on the FAFSA. Whereas if we have a 529 plan that's owned by a grandparent, we'll get to that in the next slide. Right. So if it's owned by a grandparent, it's not reported as an asset on the FAFSA, but any distributions will count as untaxed income to the student, which, as we noted before, reduces aid eligibility by as much as half of that distribution amount. That can have a really harsh impact on eligibility for need-based financial aid. So there are some workarounds, like because the FAFSA looks at 2-year-old income information, you could wait until January 1st of the child's sophomore year in college to take that distribution, assuming that the child is going to graduate in 4 years, and then it won't affect their aid eligibility. So you'd have to find some other way of paying for college during the first year and a half. And you could borrow student loans and then use the 529 plan later to pay off the student loans, because up to $10,000 per student can be used as a qualified distribution from a 529 plan. You could have the grandparent contribute to a parent-owned 529 plan instead of their own. You could also do a rollover from the grandparent-owned 529 plan to a parent-owned 529 plan with a few caveats. One is that it has to be in the same state as the grandparent-owned 529 plan, because a lot of the states will treat an outbound, out-of-state rollover as a non-qualified distribution, subjecting you to state income taxes plus possible recapture of the any state income tax breaks provided by the state. But then the simplest thing is to simply save from the start in a parent-owned 529 plan. You don't have to be the account owner of the 529 plan. Okay. So now let's talk about distributions. Right. Now, first of all, let's talk a little bit about the strategy that you should use when deciding how much and when to take distributions from a 529 plan. There are certain education tax benefits, like the American Opportunity Tax Credit, that give you up to $2,500 as a tax credit, partially refundable tax credit, based on amounts that you paid for tuition and textbooks. Well, you can't do both, and you can't double dip where you use the same qualified expenses to justify both the American Opportunity Tax Credit and the 529 plan tax-free distribution. But in most cases, you're going to have enough expenses for both, but you just need to be careful about how you do it. So you carve out $4,000 of tuition and textbook expenses to maximize the American Opportunity Tax Credit, and then you use the 529 plan to cover the remaining costs. Now, if your 529 plan funds aren't enough to cover all college costs, you might want to consider your child's eligibility to borrow student loans and take that into account. But generally speaking, you're going to have enough to cover both. Now, when you're trying to decide how much your qualified expenses are, you start with your KEE, which is your QHEE, or Qualified Higher Education Expenses, which can include K-12 tuition as well, but and student loan repayment. But you count up the total amount of qualified expenses. And by the way, 529 plans have a much broader definition of qualified expenses than the American Opportunity Tax Credit. 529 plans include room and board, not just tuition fees, book supplies, and equipment. And you subtract from this total qualified higher education expenses the amount of any tax-free educational assistance like the American Opportunity Tax Credit that you received, because the IRS doesn't like you if you double dip. Also, if you have a qualified scholarship, amounts that are used for tuition and textbooks will be tax-free, so you need to subtract that as well. What's left is your qualified education expenses that you can use to justify that tax-free distribution from a 529 plan. One important thing to note is that you have to withdraw the money from the 529 plan in the same year as the expenses are paid. You can't withdraw it early now to pay for next year unless you pay for next year this year. So let's talk about how to withdraw. You can make the amount paid to any of several individuals. You can have it paid to the account owner, the parent, who will then use that money to pay the college bills. You can pay it to the beneficiary, who does the same. You can have the money sent directly to the college. And you can, for certain expenses, like if you're living off campus, you can have the rent check sent directly to your landlord. And these payments can be made in any of several methods: by direct deposit, by check, or by an electronic payment to the school. Let's consider a scenario where, what if your child doesn't go to college? What can you do with the 529 plan money then? Maybe you have a special needs child, didn't discover this until you had already saved a lot of money, that you don't, they're not going to go to college. Well, you can use 529 plan money to pay for a trade school or a community college. It's not just four-year colleges. You can change the beneficiary to be that of a sibling who is going to college. Or if that sibling has already graduated, you can use the 529 plan to repay $10,000 of that sibling's student loans. If the child just decided that they're not going to college but may change their mind later, you can keep the money in the 529 plan and in case they decide to go to college later. Or you can change the beneficiary to yourself and do continuing education. You can use it for a lot of flexibilities. Or, since there is no time limit on when you need to use the 529 plan money, you can just keep the money in there, and instead of being used to pay for the child's education, you can use it to pay for their children's education eventually. So in fact, you're leaving a legacy for your family to ensure that they can get the benefit of a college education if they wish. Now, if your child, and there are other reasons why a child might not need the 529 plan, like if they get into one of the U.S. military academies, then their costs are being paid by the federal government. But another thing to note is that, let's say the child gets a free ride, they win a scholarship that covers all college costs. You can take a non-qualified distribution, and because the college costs were covered by that scholarship, that's an exception to the 10% tax penalty on non-qualified distributions, in which case that non-qualified distribution is generally no worse off than if you had saved in a taxable account. You may have to recapture any state tax breaks, but you've had the benefit of those state tax breaks invested in your 529 plan all along, which actually covers more than the cost of recapture of those state tax breaks. So thank you. we're going to now be switching to the Q&A portion of this talk. I just want to say that Ohio's 529 plan is giving away 30 college savings awards to celebrate the 30th anniversary, and these are really nice opportunities. To find out more information about this, go to collegeadvantage.com/anniversary. Thank
you, Mark. Well, we've had so many questions come in, as you can imagine. We've been trying to answer some of those along the way, but I know we won't have time to get to all of these, and we also had questions that came in ahead of time. So let's just go ahead and launch into the Q&A here. And actually, this one, I'm going to actually bring Tim back in to ask about this. Seemed to be a popular topic about can grandparents, James asked this, but a lot of people upvoted it, and we had other questions submitted about the same topic. Can grandparents transfer funds from a 529 to a parent's account for the same beneficiary child? And another variation on that was, how can a grandparent transfer their 529 plan to the parents if they wanted to change account owner? So can you address those two questions?
Yeah, so the second one is easier to answer, and the short of it is, yes, it's easy to change the account ownership from a grandparent if they're transferring it to their one of their children or the child's parent. There's a form that needs to be done, and I believe all plans easily facilitate this process. Getting into the other funds and transferring and doing that, it's good to consult your tax advisor, as far as moving those around and doing that. It is possible, but there's maybe some more moving pieces, and that consideration may vary from account holder to account holder and depending on beneficiaries.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tim. All right, and Mark, I know you mentioned UTMAs and UGMAs a few times, but I just had a couple questions that came up. So Matt asked, we're torn between starting an UTMA versus 529 plan. What are the pros and cons of selecting one over the other? And he also asked, what is the disadvantage of picking an UTMA over a 529 plan to safeguard the funds in case your children decide not to go to college and do not want funds locked down to education expenses only at that point? So it sounds like he's thinking about the UTMA because of the flexibility, but is asking, what are the pros and cons here?
Okay, so an UTMA is just like cash. Because the child's a minor and can't own assets, there needs to be a custodian who can control that account until the child reaches the age of majority, which is 18, 19, or 21, depending on the state. Once that child reaches the age of majority, they can use that money for any purpose whatsoever, not just paying for college. If they want to buy a sports car or a big screen TV, they can do so. Legally, that money is the child's. The parent has a fiduciary responsibility to the child to manage the money for the child's benefit. They can use the money in the UGMA or UTMA to pay for expenses for the benefit of the child. So usually it's frowned upon if you're using that money to pay for what's normally considered a parental responsibility, like food, clothing, housing. But if you're sending the child to a summer camp, or buying them a laptop computer, you can use the child's money to pay for that. A 529 plan has more restrictions. It's got to be used for college expenses, but it also has certain advantages, like superior tax and financial aid benefits. An UGMA account, you pay taxes on the interest all along, whereas on a 529 plan, you don't pay the interest until you take a distribution, and if it's a qualified distribution, it's tax-free. And financial aid perspective, if the child goes to college, money in the UGMA or UTMA will reduce their aid eligibility by 20% of the asset value, whereas money in the 529 plan is on that bracketed system with worst-case scenario 5.64% reduction in the aid eligibility based on the amount of the assets. So 5.64% of the asset value. So generally speaking, if you're pretty certain that your child is going to go to college, then a college savings plan is the right way to go. If you have some uncertainty as to whether your child's going to go to college, then you can consider things like an UTMA or UTMA or a Roth IRA. The key issue is that those can have negative impacts on financial aid eligibility and may not have the same tax advantages as a 529 plan. I mean, especially the state income tax breaks. I mean, you can get a tax break based on contributions to a 529 plan. You can't get the same tax break for a contribution to a Roth IRA or a custodial bank or brokerage account.
Actually, on that note, Mark, you could start this and Tim might have some additional thoughts to add, but another question that came up is someone had asked about, I think it was LJ, he's starting late, he has children in 10th, going into 10th and 11th grade next year. Is it too late to invest now? You were just mentioning the state tax break. So I know that not only is it not too late, I let him know that, but I thought you could address some of the benefits that he might still have from putting some money into a 529 plan at this point.
Okay. So first I want to mention that I intend to take all the questions that we've received, and there are hundreds, and I'm going to write a whole bunch of articles answering those questions over the next few weeks. So if your question doesn't get answered right now, it will eventually get answered on the savingforcollege.com website. So is it too late when the child's in next year maybe is going to college, or a year or two from now? It's not even too late when the child's already in college to save, because if you're in one of those states that has a state income tax break, you could put money into the 529 plan and then take a distribution and pay for college costs and get the benefit of that state income tax deduction or tax credit. Of the 34 states and the District of Columbia that have these state income tax breaks, only 4 prevent you from using it in that manner. And 2 of the states, its contributions net of distributions is the basis for the state income tax break. The others are a little bit more complicated. But even in those states, what you do is you do the contribution one year, and the next year you take the distribution. So you do a kind of even-odd split. So give whatever your state income tax rate is, and 3% to 10% or more, that's like getting a discount on tuition. So it's worthwhile to do that even if your child's already in college. The other thing is every dollar you save is a dollar less you're going to have to borrow. So it's a great way of reducing your student loan debt. And it literally is cheaper to save than to borrow. I mean, if you were to save money for 10 years before college, and it's versus not saving that money and then borrowing that money and looking at your monthly payments will be about double what your monthly contributions were to the 529 plan. So you end up with more money if you save than if you borrow, because when you save, you're getting the interest, whereas when you borrow, you're paying the interest.
Great. Tim, do you have anything to add to that?
No, it's a very common question. And as Mark said during his presentation, the best time is whenever a beneficiary, a child is born, to open an account. But as we all know, life goes on. Before you know it, that beneficiary is in kindergarten, middle school, and then high school, and you're looking at whatever's coming after high school. So like one of our partners likes to say, when's the best time to plant a tree? Well, that was 20 years ago. When's the next best time? Today.
Love it. That's a great answer. Tim, now for somebody who has savings and is looking at withdrawing, I think we touched on this a little bit in the presentation, but let's see, Joseph was asking about what's the best way to process withdrawals for payment of expenses. I think different plans may do this a little bit differently, but he's asking, should it go to the school directly, the student, the parent? So what information can you provide on that?
Yeah, Mark touched on this during his presentation, and the plans are flexible. The short of it, it depends on the desire of the account holder. Many people are comfortable; they just want the payment to go directly to the educational entity. and forget about it. Others prefer that the withdrawal comes to them and they pay the bills. Or as Mark alluded, it can go to a landlord. Or in some cases, it'll just go to the beneficiary and they'll manage that payment. And so it's an individual preference and what people are comfortable with. And I think it's a uniqueness of the plan where it's not just limited that if the account holder is giving instructions for withdrawal or payment, it has to go to the account holder. There is flexibility as to how those withdrawals are processed and who receives those funds.
Great. Mark, we still have a few minutes. We can squeeze in a few more questions. So Preetham asks, I have two kids, one in high school, the other in elementary. Is it advisable to allocate all 529 savings toward the younger child to take advantage of the financial aid for the elder kid?
Right. So there's two aspects to this. One is when you have two children, do you have two 529 plans or do you have one 529 plan? The other is trying to optimize the financial aid eligibility by having the money in the younger child's 529 plan so that it doesn't count against the older child's. So first of all, with regard to having two 529 plans or one, some of the state tax breaks are per beneficiary. And with a single 529 plan, you can have only one beneficiary. So there's an advantage to having two 529 plans because you can get a much greater state income tax break when you have two versus one. Also, because the children are different ages, the age-based investment allocation will be different because one is going to be closer to college than the other. And so it's not optimal to have one 529 plan for both kids. It's better to have separate so that each 529 plan can reflect the different goals for that child's education as well as how close they are to a college education. Now, with regard to trying to manipulate the financial aid formula, when you have money in a 529 plan, it's reported as a parent asset on the FAFSA. If it's owned by the parent, or is in a custodial 529 plan account. And so it's going to get reported regardless. Certainly on the CSS profile form, they count all assets that name that beneficiary regardless of who the account owner is. Whereas with the FAFSA, it's parent assets, child assets. Now, if you had money in an UGMA account in the younger child's name, that wouldn't get reported as an asset for the older child on the older child's FAFSA. But the CSS profile does take into account assets of siblings because they're trying to prevent families from taking advantage of this loophole on the FAFSA. But generally speaking, it's a relatively small impact overall on the financial aid that you receive. Usually families who have higher income, the income on its own without regard to assets is going to affect whether or not they get financial aid. The assets tend to reflect income to a large extent.
All right. Tim, a lot of people have asked about rollovers. They ask questions like, can a 529 be transferred between states? So if I have one state and I move to another state, can I transfer it? Can I roll it over? Can you address that a little bit?
Yes, that's an often a consideration for account holders. Maybe they're moving into a state and there's a better state advantage, tax advantage that's offered, and then they want to bring their 529s into that state. You can do that, and there's not a penalty. That's not considered a taxable occurrence. There's nothing wrong. We have some of our customers who started their account in one state and perhaps moved to Ohio and opened another one. There's not a limitation as far as you have to consolidate those. You can leave them if you're pleased with the plan that you had, but you moving to you like the plan in the state that you're moving to. So again, there's a lot of flexibility and little or no penalty if you want to roll that over from one. Well, there's no penalty if you're rolling it over from one plan to another.
All right, thanks, Tim. And Mark, do you have, so basically, Tim, I think you said two things. One is you can keep one plan and open a new plan, or you can roll it over. And Mark, do you have anything to add to that as far as anything people should be aware of if they are doing rollovers?
Well, if you do a rollover to an out-of-state plan, it is in many states going to be considered to be a non-qualified distribution. So you have to check your state's rules. And some states are fine with it, some states are not. So a lot depends on the individual state plans. I also want to clarify something I said that may have been confusing in the previous answer. If you have a custodial 529 plan account, it is reported as a parent asset on that student's FAFSA, but may not necessarily need to be reported as an asset on the sibling's FAFSA. I just want to make sure that that was really clear, because my answer may not have been 100% clear.
Got it. Mark, maybe we could squeeze in one more quick question, because I see we still have a lot of people on, and I know we had some sort of topical questions that came up. One was about how does online learning impact qualified distributions? You know, in these days with so many schools that have moved to online learning, can you address that?
Right, so your mix of expenses for online education may be slightly different. Your room and board might be different because you're living at home. Colleges usually have 3 or 4 student aid budgets where students who live in college dormitories have a different budget from students who live off campus, from students who live with their parents, and the fourth one is for students who live on a military base where their room, their housing is paid for. Some colleges don't have very big room and board components for students who are living at home. So that may reduce your amount of qualified expenses. Another set of expenses that you may have may involve things like having a computer and having internet access, maybe having peripherals and software. And so the nice thing is those are considered qualified higher education expenses, and so you can use the 529 plan to pay for them. One thing that people often don't realize is that 529 plans do not have transportation as a qualified expense, and since you're living at home, you're not going to have transportation expenses, so your college costs may go down. Now, you can't use the 529 plan to pay for them, but because you don't have them, it doesn't matter.
Right, okay, great. And one last one I'm going to throw to Tim. You mentioned this at the beginning, and we did have a question on should coronavirus-related college refunds be redeposited into 529s in order to avoid a taxable event?
Right, and you know, to the point that Mark made earlier about using expenses within a calendar year, obviously you get that refund, and if you anticipate you're going to have expenses later in this calendar year, you can just hold on to those. But many people want to put those back into their 529, and you need to do so within 60 days, and that's not considered an event with consequences, as one trying to say.
Okay. All right, we have gone over. Thank you both for hanging on. Thanks for our participants for hanging in. There's so many of you. As Mark said, yeah, we got over 100 questions. So I'll be sharing all of these with Mark, and he'll be writing about them on our site. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Tim. Thanks to the audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.